All right, diving in today, ready to explore something, well, pretty crucial, I think. And, you, our listeners, you're the ones who kind of nudged us in this direction. We're talking about the ethics of clinical research.
Yeah, definitely a weighty topic.
It really is, because at the core of it, there's this, like, really fundamental philosophical question, right? Like, when is it actually okay ethically to, you know, maybe expose some people to risks, potential harm, all for the sake of helping others. And those others might be way down the line in the future.
It's a question that cuts to the heart of so much of what we do in medicine. And the materials you sent over, they really dig into those ethical knots. It's complex.
No kidding. We're talking about, the very foundation of how we decide what treatments work, what's safe. It's clinical research, right? It's how
Mhm.
we figure out if a new drug, a new device, a new therapy, any of that, if it actually does what it's supposed to, and if it does it without causing more harm than good.
Exactly. Think of it like, I don't know, the bedrock of evidence-based medicine. It's how we move forward, how we make progress in treating and preventing all kinds of diseases.
You're right, it is progress. But then, right away, we run smack into this ethical dilemma. Because to make that progress, we're asking people to be part of this research. They might get a new treatment, sure, but it's experimental. There are unknowns. Maybe there are extra procedures, tests, things they wouldn't have to go through otherwise. And the kicker is, often, the direct benefit to them, the person in the study, it might be small or even non-existent.
Yeah. That's the tough part. The main goal of a lot of research isn't to help the people in that specific study. It's to gather data, information that can be used to help others later on.
Exactly. And so it's like this mini version of this huge philosophical problem, right? Like in any situation, when is it okay morally to put some people at risk for the supposed good of everyone else? It's a question that pops up everywhere from, I don't know, building a bridge to running a factory to making personal choices.
Right. And as we wade into these deep waters, we're going to be looking at this problem through different philosophical lenses. It's not just a simple equation, that's for sure. And the history of clinical research, well, it's a stark reminder of how carefully we have to tread here.
Okay, so let's break it down. I mean, for someone coming at this from a philosophical perspective, what is clinical research in the context we're talking about?
Well, at its heart, clinical research is a very particular type of research that involves humans, right? Human subjects research is the broader category. But clinical research, it's got this specific focus, evaluating interventions.
Interventions.
Yeah, interventions. We're talking
Sure.
about drugs, medical devices, therapies, even changes to someone's lifestyle. And the point is to figure out, do these interventions actually improve health? Do they work to treat, cure, or prevent illnesses?
So the main goal is to deal with disease, to try to help people get better or stay healthy.
Got it. But what about, things that aren't strictly about illness? Like, what if the intervention is meant to, I don't know, enhance someone, make them better in some way, improve their quality of life, even if they're not technically sick?
That's an interesting point. It's a bit of a blurry line sometimes. I mean, for our conversation here, based on what you've shared, we're mostly focused on research that's trying to address illness and disease.
Right, right.
The ethics around things like enhancements or, I don't know, quality improvement projects, like if a hospital is checking to see if using checklists reduces errors, that kind of thing, those can be different.
I see. So the focus is on, like, fixing what's broken health-wise.
Yeah. And drawing those lines, even if they're a little fuzzy sometimes, it matters. Especially when you think about rules and regulations and how important informed consent is. Makes sense. So the core idea of clinical research, at least for our deep dive here, it's about tackling diseases where, let's be honest, what we have now, it isn't good enough. The examples in these sources, malaria, chronic diseases, Alzheimer's, it's a powerful reminder of how much work there is to do.
Absolutely. And something to keep in mind, medical progress, it's usually not about one big sudden breakthrough. It's more like a slow and steady climb. It's rare that a single study gives us all the answers we need. It's the combined impact, the weight of many, many studies that leads to real progress in how we understand and treat diseases.
Right, like building a wall brick by brick, each study adds a little bit more.
Yeah, exactly. You think about how long it takes to get a new drug out there. From the very first discovery to all the testing, it's a long road.
Speaking of steps, the different phases of clinical trials, those are laid out pretty clearly in what we've got here, from phase 0 all the way to phase 4. And it looks like the whole risk-benefit balance, it really shifts depending on what phase you're talking about.
It definitely does.
Yeah.
Phase 1 studies, those are particularly interesting, ethically speaking. I mean, these are the first time a new intervention is tested on humans.
First time ever.
First time ever. It's usually a pretty small group of people. And Often these are healthy volunteers. They're not even sick.
Wow.
Yeah, it's about understanding how the drug or whatever it is, how it acts in the human body, how it gets absorbed, broken down, all that. And of course, safety is a huge focus.
Yeah.
Figuring out the right dose, making sure it's not immediately dangerous. The thing is, in phase one, the participants, they're often facing risks, but there's very little chance they'll get any direct benefit from it.
So they're basically taking a risk, but it's all for the sake of knowledge that might help someone else later on.
Exactly. And from an ethical standpoint, you have to think about not just the intervention itself, but also all the procedures that come with being in a research study. Maybe they need extra blood draws, biopsies, things like that. And then there's the impact of the entire study itself. Sometimes getting the experimental treatment, it might actually be in the participant's best interest, like if it's a promising new cancer drug, for example. But especially in those early phases or with certain research procedures, participants might be taking on what the sources call net risks.
Net risks, that sounds important.
It is. It basically means the risks they're taking, they're not fully balanced out by any potential benefit to them, at least not a direct medical benefit.
So it's like they're putting more in than they're getting out, in a way.
Yeah, in a way. And the sources break these net risks down even further into absolute, relative, and indirect risks. It's helpful to understand the differences.
Yeah, let's unpack that a bit.
Sure. So absolute net risks, those happen when there's really no potential clinical benefit for the person in the study. It's all risk, no direct reward, like those phase one trials with healthy volunteers, or even just getting blood drawn for a study, even if the study itself has some potential benefit. It's just for the sake of research.
Okay, absolute net risk, all risk, no direct benefit. What about relative?
Relative net risks, that's when the intervention in the study, it might have some benefit, enough to maybe justify the risks on its own. But here's the thing. There's another treatment out there that has a better risk-benefit balance. It works better, or it's safer, or both.
Ah, so it's like they're getting something, but they could be getting something better if they weren't in the study.
Exactly. The sources use the example of comparing a cheaper drug to a more expensive one. The cheaper drug might work a little, but not as well as the pricey one. People getting the cheaper drug in the study, they're facing a relative net risk. And then there's indirect net risks.
Okay, hit me with indirect.
This one's a little tricky. This is when the intervention being studied, it might be fine on its own, good risk-benefit ratio, all that. But here's the catch. It messes with other treatments the person is already getting.
Oh, so it's like the research itself is causing problems with their regular medical care.
Exactly. So to sum it up for you, absolute net risk means no direct benefit to balance the risk. Relative means there's a better option out there. And indirect means the research is interfering with other treatments that are helping them.
Okay, those distinctions, they really highlight why exposing people to risks in research, it's ethically fraught. It's not just about, will someone get hurt? It's about the whole context, the alternatives, all of that. And the sources pointed out something I hadn't really thought about. Even just knowing you're exposed to risk, that can have negative consequences.
Oh, absolutely. You can think about the psychological impact, the fear, the anxiety, or, maybe they have to take extra precautions, change their routine, all because they're in this study. It's a burden.
Right, right. And even if the risk never actually turns into harm, those burdens are real.
For sure. And this leads to a really big ethical question, How is exposing someone to risk so that a specific person, someone they know, can benefit, like donating a kidney to your brother? How is that different ethically from exposing someone to risk for the benefit of people they don't know, people in the future who might benefit from the research someday?
Yeah, it does feel different, doesn't it? Like donating an organ to someone you love, that's often seen as this incredibly selfless act. But taking on risks in a research study for people you'll never meet, it feels more, I don't know, abstract, maybe even a little exploitative in a way.
That's a key point. And the thing is, that connection between the risk and the future benefit, it's not always a sure thing. The research might not pan out, maybe it won't get approved, or maybe the people who need it most won't be able to get it. And the sources, they even touch on the ethics of storing biological samples, blood or tissue, and using them for research later on, maybe for something completely different than what the person originally consented to.
Right, the whole question of like future risks, things changing down the line. And they use the example of the Havasupai tribe, which is pretty powerful. Their DNA was used for research that ended up contradicting their traditional beliefs about their ancestry. It shows how research can have consequences that go way beyond just physical health.
Absolutely. It's not just about the body. It's about identity, culture, all of that. So to really understand the ethical issues here, I think we have to look back, see how clinical research got to where it is today. The good and the bad, the progress, and the times when things went very wrong.
Yeah, the whole historical context.
Exactly. I mean, a lot of people point to the 18th century, a guy named James Lind, and his experiment on scurvy back in 1747.
Oh, right. The one with the sailors on the HMS Salisbury.
Yeah.
He was trying to figure out how to cure scurvy, and he gave different groups different things to eat, including, famously, oranges and lemons. It's considered one of the first real controlled trials, right?
It is. Lind didn't just guess. He was methodical. He divided those sailors up, made sure the groups were as similar as possible, and then gave them different treatments. And the results, they were pretty clear. The group that got the citrus fruits, they recovered dramatically.
Amazing.
It was. But, right away, Lynn's work brings up this ethical question that's relevant to our whole discussion.
Mm.
Did he sacrifice those sailors who didn't get the citrus? I mean, he knew it was working for some of them, but the others were still suffering. Was it right to keep them on those other treatments just for the sake of proving his point?
Yeah, it's that tension again. The duty to each individual patient versus the drive to find knowledge that will help everyone in the future.
Right. And Lynn, he was even trying to control for other factors, making sure the sailors were in similar condition, had similar diets, all except for the specific treatments he was testing. Which makes it even more interesting that it took decades for the Royal Navy to actually start giving their sailors citrus rations, even though the evidence was pretty clear.
It just shows that doing good research, it's not enough. You have to get the word out, make sure people actually use the knowledge.
You do. And while Lynn's experiment, it was groundbreaking, he wasn't using randomization. That came later, with randomized controlled trials, like the one with streptomycin for tuberculosis in 1948. The idea was to get rid of as much bias as possible, so they used a random process to decide who got which treatment.
But for a philosopher, that brings up a whole other ethical tangle, right? It's like you're taking the decision out of the hands of the doctor, the one who's supposed to know what's best for each individual patient, and you're leaving it up to chance.
Exactly. It can seem almost backwards. Like if a doctor flipped a coin to decide your treatment, you'd think they were completely irresponsible. But in a well-designed research study, doing the same thing can be seen as the best way to get reliable results.
It highlights how weird this whole thing is. Like, to move medical knowledge forward, to help people in the future, sometimes you have to do things that would be totally wrong in a normal doctor-patient relationship. And then there's the really dark side of all this. The history of clinical research, it's full of examples where things went horribly wrong, ethically speaking.
It is. It's crucial to remember those. The Nazi experiments, the Tuskegee syphilis study, even some of the early research on children, it's a stark reminder of what can happen when research isn't done ethically, when there's no respect for the people involved.
No kidding. And those terrible cases, they directly led to the creation of formal ethical guidelines, right?
They did. The Nuremberg Code, that was one of the first, and it came out of the trials of Nazi doctors after World War II. It was a set of principles, rules for how research should be conducted ethically. And informed consent, that was a huge part of it. The idea that people have to freely agree to participate, knowing the risks involved.
Which makes sense. But the sources point out that focusing so heavily on informed consent, it created its own set of problems, especially when it came to research involving people who couldn't give informed consent, like children or people with dementia.
Right. If you take informed consent as the be-all and end-all, then that kind of research, it would be off the table. And that could mean missing out on important discoveries, things that could help those very same people.
Yeah, it's a catch-22, so what happened?
Well, the World Medical Association, they came up with a Declaration of Helsinki, which tried to address some of the issues with the Nuremberg Code. It recognized that sometimes you have to do research with people who can't consent, but it put in strong safeguards, like you have to get permission from a legal guardian, and there has to be review by an independent ethics committee.
So more layers of oversight.
Exactly. And then in the U.S., you have the federal regulations, a lot of which comes from the NIH and the FDA. These aren't like laws passed by Congress for every single type of research, but they're very influential, especially for studies that get government funding or need FDA approval.
Right.
And these regulations, they put even stricter limits on how much risk you can expose people to, especially if they can't consent themselves. For research on children, they have specific categories of risk. And if the study goes beyond a certain level of risk, and there's no chance the child will directly benefit, then the review process is much tougher.
It makes sense, I guess. It's about protecting the most vulnerable people while still allowing research that could ultimately help them. So the ethical rules around clinical research, they've come a long way. But that basic tension, the balancing act between risks and benefits, it's still there.
It is. It's baked into the whole endeavor. And this idea of how clinical research relates to regular medical care, that's a key part of the debate. Some people argue that the ethical principles of healthcare, they should apply to research too. The idea that the patient's well-being comes first, that you should always be trying to help them, not put them at further risk.
So if you're doing research, it's like you're still acting as a doctor with all the same ethical responsibilities.
Exactly. And if you take that view, it has huge implications for randomized controlled trials, those studies where you use chance to decide who gets which treatment. Because, in normal healthcare, that would be considered irresponsible.
Right, right. The doctor is supposed to use their judgment, figure out what's best for each patient, not leave it up to a coin toss.
Exactly. And this is where the idea of clinical equipoise comes in. It's this concept that tries to justify randomization ethically by saying that it's only okay if there's genuine uncertainty among experts about which treatment is actually better.
So if the doctors truly don't know which treatment is best, then it's okay to randomly assign people to one or the other because you're not actually depriving anyone of something that's known to be better.
Right. The argument is that in that situation, the people in the study, their interests aren't really being harmed because no one knows for sure what the best course of action is. But critics point out that even if there's equipoise at a general level, for the whole group, each individual patient might have specific things going on that make one treatment better for them, regardless of what the research is trying to find out. And randomization, it ignores those individual factors.
Yeah, what's best for the average person in this study might not be what's best for this specific person sitting in the doctor's office. And the sources emphasize that a lot of research activities, especially early on in the process, or even specific things done in later studies, they might not have anything to do with the patient's immediate medical needs.
That's true. And that's where people have tried to draw a line between therapeutic research and non-therapeutic research as a way to justify doing things that have net risk that might not help the person directly.
Like, if the research is specifically trying to benefit the person in the study, then maybe the ethical bar is higher. But if it's just for the sake of knowledge, maybe it's okay to take on more risk.
Yeah, that's the basic idea. But the sources you shared, they're pretty critical of that distinction. It sounds like it's hard to actually define where the line is in real-world situations. And even more importantly, it's not clear why a researcher's ethical obligations to a participant should change based on whether the study is labeled therapeutic or not.
It seems like a bit of a dodge, in a way.
It can be, and
Yeah.
it gets back to that fundamental question we keep coming back to. Justification. If you're going to expose people to net risks in research, what makes that okay ethically? The sources lay out a few different philosophical perspectives on this. One is called the libertarian view.
Okay, libertarianism. So what's that all about?
Well, this view really puts individual freedom and autonomy front and center. It's about the right to make your own choices, even if those choices are risky. And in this context, the idea is that if someone, a competent adult, if they freely choose to participate in research, knowing all the facts, understanding the risks, and they consent, then that's all you need. It's ethically permissible, end of story. It doesn't matter if the research is dangerous or if it's only going to benefit other people.
So it's like my body, my choice, taken to the extreme, applied to research.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. It's about self-ownership, the right to decide what happens to you, even in a research study. But the thing is, almost no one in research ethics today actually holds this pure libertarian view without some caveats. Informed consent, yes, that's absolutely fundamental. But pretty much every set of rules and guidelines, starting with the Declaration of Helsinki, they also say there has to be independent review, a check to make sure the study itself is ethically sound. And there are limits on what kind of research can be done, even if people consent, based on things like how valuable the research is and how to minimize the risks.
So it's not as simple as just letting people decide whatever they want.
Not quite. And the libertarian view, it really struggles when you're talking about research involving people who can't consent, like children, people in emergencies, people with cognitive impairments.
Right, because if informed consent is the only thing that matters, then you'd basically never be able to do research with those groups. And that would mean missing out on a lot of potential progress, like finding new treatments for kids.
Exactly. Some libertarians might say, well, our view only applies to adults who can make their own decisions. But that still leaves a big hole. You still need to explain when it's okay to do research with people who can't consent, and why.
Right. So what's the alternative?
Well, the sources talk about this idea of soft paternalism.
Yeah.
It's like sometimes you have to step in and protect people from themselves, even if they're technically capable of making their own choices,
Yeah.
because maybe their judgment is clouded or they don't have all the information.
So in research, that would mean things like making sure people really understand what they're agreeing to, having independent review, all that.
Yeah. The argument is that those kinds of safeguards, they're actually helping people to make truly informed decisions, not just overriding their choices. It's about protecting their autonomy in a deeper way, not just letting them walk into something they don't fully understand.
That's an interesting way to look at it. But the sources also make the point that even if you have the best informed consent process in the world, that's still not enough to justify any research. There have to be basic moral standards for how researchers treat people, regardless of what those people agree to.
Absolutely. They use this kind of extreme example, like imagine a lab that's doing research on the effects of abuse, and they get people to consent to being abused as part of the study.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it's obviously unethical, even if those people said yes. It shows that ethics in research, it's not just about respecting individual choices. It's about recognizing that there are certain things you just can't do to another human being, no matter what.
So there are limits, even on autonomy.
There are. And then the whole idea of research exceptionalism comes up. It's this idea that clinical research is so unique, so potentially dangerous, that it needs all these extra rules and regulations, much more than other risky things we do in life.
Right, like driving a car or working in a factory. There are risks there, but we don't have all this oversight.
Exactly. And some people argue that maybe we're being too cautious with research, that maybe it should be treated more like those other activities. Get informed consent, make sure people are fairly compensated for the risks they're taking, and that's enough.
Wow, that's a pretty big shift from how things are now. And this also brings up the whole debate about paying research participants, which is a can of worms in itself.
It is.
Yeah.
Traditionally, there's been a lot of worry about paying people too much because it could pressure them into doing something risky, even if they wouldn't otherwise.
Yeah.
There's this idea that it undermines altruism, the willingness to participate for the good of others. And there's the concern that people might be misled, told it's not that risky, just to get them to sign up.
Right, like they're being exploited.
But, the people who question research exceptionalism, they often see payment as just fair compensation for the time, effort, and risk involved. Like, if you're doing a dangerous job, you expect to be paid more. And in research, the stakes can be really high. If a company makes billions from a drug that was developed through research, shouldn't the people who took the risks in those studies get a bigger piece of the pie?
That's a good point. It's not just about preventing exploitation. It's about making sure people are properly rewarded for their contributions. And then there's this whole new idea of learning healthcare systems, which the sources talk about as potentially changing everything.
Yeah, this is really interesting. Historically, research became very separate from regular medical care. And for good reasons, right? You don't want doctors experimenting on their patients willy-nilly.
Right, you need those safeguards.
But that separation, it has its downsides. Research gets more expensive, it's harder to do, and sometimes the results, they don't translate well to real-world medical practice. So the idea of a learning healthcare system is to bring research and care back together, to make it seamless. It's about constantly using data from everyday medical practice to improve treatments, to learn as you go.
So instead of having separate clinical trials, research is just built into the system. You're always collecting data, always analyzing it, always trying to do better.
Exactly. And the hope is that this will help to solve that ethical dilemma of risks and benefits, because taking on some risk becomes part of a system that's designed to benefit everyone who's part of it. Of course, it raises new ethical questions too, like how do you make sure patients understand that their information is being used for research? How do you handle those added risks that come with being part of a learning system? What about people who don't want to participate in the research part?
It's like the ethical landscape is shifting.
It is, and we have to keep thinking about it, analyzing it as these systems evolve.
So we've covered a lot of ground here, and it's clear there are no easy answers when it comes to the ethics of clinical research. There are all these different philosophical viewpoints, and the debate is far from over. It's about respecting individual autonomy, but also recognizing that research is essential for progress, for helping people in the future. It's about weighing risks and benefits, but also making sure that research is done ethically, that people aren't being exploited.
Yeah. We've talked about some fascinating historical moments like Lynn's experiment and the Tuskegee study. We've unpacked some complex concepts like clinical equipoise and research exceptionalism, and we've looked at how individual choices fit into the bigger picture with ideas like libertarianism and soft paternalism.
And the role of industry, that's a whole other layer of complexity. It's about money,
Mm.
about profits, and how that can influence research, for better or worse. And then there's the potential for these learning healthcare systems to really shake things up, to change the way we think about risks and benefits and how research is done.
Definitely a lot to think about.
Absolutely.
Oh.
So to our listeners, we'd love to hear your thoughts. After going through all this, what resonates with you? What framework, what set of principles do you think makes the most sense for navigating this tricky ethical terrain? Because how we answer these questions, it has a huge impact on how research is done and ultimately on everyone's health and well-being.
Thanks for sharing your sources and for joining us on this deep dive. This is definitely something worth pondering, debating, and continuing to explore. The questions, they don't go away, and that's a good thing. It means we're paying attention, we're striving to do better.